What the cameras didn't see was the clause. This wasn't just a divorce. It was a strategy.
Before we start, like this video and tell us where you're watching from. The stamp came down harder than it needed to. A sharp crack echoed across the quiet clerk's desk inside Hennepin County Family Court. Ink pressed into paper. The date fixed in permanent blue. Divorce filed. Across the counter stood Zaria Volkov. Her gloves were still in her hand. Snow melted slowly along the edge of her boots, leaving small, dark marks on the courthouse tile. Outside, Minneapolis lay buried under January frost. Reporters waited beyond the revolving doors, their breath visible in the air. Behind her name on the petition stood another, Dmitry Volkov, Russian billionaire, tech magnate, owner of Volkov Systems North America, a man who once dominated Minnesota business headlines for growth and expansion. Today, his name sat on a dissolution of marriage form. Zaria did not blink when the clerk slid the documents forward. Her attorney stood to her left, calm, watchful. "Everything is filed," the clerk said quietly. Filed. The word settled heavily. Less than 12 hours earlier, she had stood beside Dmitry at a charity banquet near Lake Minnetonka. Cameras had captured him correcting her publicly, laughing at her, calling her unprepared before a room full of investors. This morning, those same cameras waited for confirmation of something far bigger. A marriage ending, not in private, in headlines. The courthouse doors opened briefly as someone exited. Cold air swept in. Flashes went off instinctively, though she had not stepped outside yet. Zaria lifted the top page. Her eyes moved once across the first paragraph. Then she saw it. A clause she had never approved. Her fingers tightened slightly against the paper. She looked up. The clause sat halfway down the second page. Minnesota Property Trust Allocation. Zaria read the paragraph again, slower this time. It stated that certain lakefront holdings, transferred into a family trust 2 years earlier, were to remain under Dmitry Volkov's sole control. The language implied her prior consent. She had never signed such consent. Her attorney noticed the pause. "What is it?" he asked quietly. She turned the document toward him without speaking. His jaw tightened as his eyes scanned the section. "This was not in the draft we reviewed." The air around them felt heavier, though the courthouse remained calm. A printer hummed somewhere behind the clerk's desk. Footsteps echoed down the corridor. Zaria's mind moved quickly. Lake Minnetonka Estate, North Loop Investment Properties, the downtown Minneapolis penthouse held through Volkov Systems, assets built during the marriage. She helped negotiate when Dmitry first expanded operations into Minnesota. Outside, a wave of camera shutters erupted again. Someone must have confirmed the filing. Her name would be attached to every headline by noon. Russian billionaire files for divorce from wife. Public humiliation followed by legal separation. The narrative would form without her input. Her attorney leaned closer. "We can challenge this. If this transfer occurred without full disclosure, we have grounds." Zaria folded the corner of the page carefully, marking the clause without damaging the document. She felt the shock settle into something steadier. This was no longer about embarrassment. It was about protection. Across the lobby, the revolving doors spun again. The press had spotted movement inside. She inhaled once, slow and measured. "Let's review every transfer made in the last 3 years," she said. The first flash struck through the courthouse glass before she reached the doors. Light scattered across polished floors and reflected against melting snow tracked inside by reporters who had pushed closer to the entrance. Microphones lifted the moment security stepped aside. "Mrs. Volkov, is the divorce confirmed? Was last night the breaking point? Did the property dispute cause this?" Questions collided midair. Zaria stopped just inside the threshold. Cold wind slipped through the revolving doors each time they turned, brushing against her coat. Minneapolis traffic crawled along 3rd Street. Camera crews lined the sidewalk, boots planted in slush. Less than a day ago, she had stood in a gold silk gown beside Dmitry under chandelier light. He had corrected her in front of donors, laughed when she hesitated during a speech, called her out of her depth. Clips of that moment were already circulating online. Now the legal filing had transformed humiliation into spectacle. Her attorney stepped forward, but she placed a hand lightly on his arm. She would speak. Today I filed for divorce in Hennepin County, she said evenly. This is a private matter that will be handled respectfully. No anger, no tears. The restraint unsettled the crowd more than outrage would have. A reporter shouted, "Did he transfer property without your approval?" Her expression did not change. "I will not discuss financial details." The statement held weight without giving them more. The narrative forming outside did not match the stillness inside her. Shock had passed. Embarrassment had passed. What remained was focus. As she stepped into the snow, flashes intensified, reflecting off icy pavement. Above her, the Minneapolis skyline stood cold and indifferent. By the time she reached the black SUV waiting at the curb, her phone had begun to vibrate non-stop. News alerts, investor statements, private messages from acquaintances who had attended the banquet the night before. Dmitry had not called. He did not need to. His public relations team had already issued a brief statement to Minnesota business outlets. Irreconcilable differences, mutual decision, respect for privacy. Zaria almost smiled at the phrasing. Mutual. She had learned about the filing less than 24 hours ago, after enduring his correction at the podium. He leaned toward her in front of guests and said loud enough to be heard, "Stick to what you understand." Laughter followed. Soft, uncomfortable, but audible. The SUV door shut, sealing out the winter noise. For a moment, silence wrapped around her. Her attorney sat across from her in the back seat. He opened his tablet and pulled up preliminary financial summaries. Dmitry transferred 3 Minnesota properties into the trust last quarter, he said. The signatures show authorization. My signature? She asked. Yes. Zaria looked out the window as the vehicle pulled away from the courthouse. Snowbanks lined the street. Pedestrians moved carefully across salted sidewalks. She remembered the evening he asked her to sign routine expansion documents. She had trusted him. The paperwork had been stacked with others from Volkov Systems. No explanation of property restructuring. No conversation about exclusion. The humiliation at the banquet now felt less accidental, more calculated. She turned back to her attorney. Freeze any additional transfers immediately, she said, and subpoena the trust records. The SUV merged into downtown traffic. Her marriage had become a headline, but this battle would be handled in detail. By noon, Minnesota business outlets had updated their banners. Russian billionaire files for divorce in Minneapolis. Clips from the banquet replayed beside courthouse footage. Analysts speculated. Comment sections filled quickly. Opinions formed without context. Inside her temporary office suite overlooking the Mississippi River, Zaria sat at a long oak table with documents spread before her. The Minnesota Property Trust Clause lay highlighted. Her attorney had already contacted a forensic accountant. Preliminary findings suggested timing that did not align with standard restructuring. Transfers occurred shortly after Dmitry secured a major state contract. Why isolate these assets? Her attorney asked. Zaria leaned back slightly. Because he knew I understood their value, she said. Lakefront holdings, commercial spaces near North Loop, a development project tied to St. Paul expansion. She had negotiated early leases. She had introduced Dmitry to local partners when Volkov Systems entered Minnesota. Her involvement had not been ceremonial. Her phone buzzed again. A message from an unknown number. She hesitated, then opened it. Attached was a scanned document. Trust Amendment Addendum. Her signature appeared at the bottom, but the date was altered. 2 digits changed. Her pulse steadied rather than raced. This was no longer about public embarrassment. This was documentation, proof. She placed the phone face down and looked at her attorney. We will challenge the validity of this amendment, she said calmly, and we will audit every transaction tied to it. Outside, winter light reflected off the river. Inside, the direction of this case shifted. The divorce had begun as a spectacle. It was becoming something else entirely. Have you ever been blindsided in public? Comment where you would stand in this moment. 2 years earlier, Minnesota felt like a promise. Summer light stretched long over Lake Minnetonka, reflecting off quiet water and polished docks. The Volkov residence stood at the edge of a private inlet, glass walls open to warm air and conversation drifting from the patio. Zaria moved easily among guests that afternoon. Local founders, State officials, tech investors from Minneapolis and St. Paul. Dmitri stood nearby, one hand resting at the small of her back as he introduced her to partners entering the North American expansion market. "My wife understands this region better than anyone," he said, pride clear in his voice. "She built our first relationships here." He meant it then. Zaria had relocated from Chicago after marrying him, learning Minnesota business networks quickly. She attended early planning meetings, reviewed zoning maps, negotiated local contracts for Volkov Systems when they secured their first Minneapolis office. Their partnership was visible. At launch events, they stood side by side. At charity functions, they hosted together. Articles described them as disciplined and aligned. She handled community engagement. He managed global investors. It worked. The Minneapolis Tech launch event later that fall drew press from across the Midwest. Dmitri announced a new data infrastructure center. Zaria spoke briefly about job creation and state partnerships. Applause followed. Afterward, he kissed her cheek in front of the cameras. "You were perfect," he said softly. She believed the success belonged to both of them. As twilight settled over the lake that summer evening, guests raised glasses to growth and expansion. The foundation of their public image felt solid. The first winter in Minnesota tested them in different ways. Snow buried the lake house docks. The river iced over. Business slowed briefly after the holidays, giving them rare, quiet evenings inside the Minneapolis penthouse. Zaria used that time to outline community initiatives tied to Volkov Systems' expansion. She proposed partnerships with state universities, coding workshops for local students, and grants for minority-owned startups. Dmitri listened at the kitchen island, scrolling through quarterly projections. "These programs are generous," he said, tone thoughtful but measured. "But we must protect margins." She nodded. "Growth depends on trust here. Minnesota values long-term investment." He studied her for a moment before responding. "You are becoming emotional about this market." The comment was subtle, not sharp, not cruel, but it lingered. She had built the local connections. She understood how the state operated. Yet the phrasing shifted something small. Emotional. At the next strategy meeting in their North Loop office, Zaria presented partnership data to senior executives. Dmitri followed with financial forecasts. When she suggested allocating additional funds toward community relations, he adjusted the numbers publicly. "We will consider that later," he said. "For now, expansion speed matters more." His correction was calm, professional. The room accepted it without question. Afterward, in the elevator, she asked, "Did you disagree with the proposal?" "I refined it," he replied. "You focus on relationships. I handle scaling." The division of roles sounded practical. Yet the space between contribution and authority had begun to shift. Spring returned with press coverage. Volkov Systems secured a state infrastructure contract, placing Dmitri on the front page of Minneapolis business journals. Interviews multiplied. Invitations followed. At a networking reception in downtown St. Paul, Zaria stood beside him as donors and legislators approached. She answered questions about workforce development. She discussed the university partnerships she had initiated. Several guests complimented her strategic insight. Dmitri smiled through most of it. Later that evening, as they stood near the ballroom entrance, a state senator turned to Zaria and said, "Your outreach program changed how we viewed this company." Before she could respond fully, Dmitri stepped in. "My team handled the execution," he said smoothly. "Zaria helped introduce us." The wording was slight. "Helped introduce." She noticed the shift instantly. Not led, not built, introduced. The senator nodded politely, unaware of the difference. On the drive back to Minneapolis, city lights reflecting across the windshield, she remained quiet for several minutes. "You minimized my role," she said finally. Dmitri kept his eyes on the road. Public messaging must remain consistent. Investors expect centralized leadership. "I am not a marketing prop," she replied, voice steady. He exhaled slowly. "You are my wife, and that position already carries influence." The answer sounded like reassurance. It felt like containment. When they reached the penthouse, he kissed her forehead and moved directly to his office. She stood alone in the living room, staring at the skyline. The correction had been polite. But it had been deliberate. By their third year in Minnesota, admiration surrounded them. Profiles described Dmitri as decisive. Articles described Zaria as gracious and intelligent. Together, they were labeled disciplined and visionary. At a Lake Minnetonka summer gathering hosted by regional investors, the tone shifted again. Zaria spoke with two founders about workforce diversity metrics. She outlined how Volkov Systems had increased local hiring by partnering with Minneapolis coding academies. One of the founders said, "That strategy positioned you ahead of competitors." Dmitri approached just as she finished explaining projected outcomes. He placed a light hand at her waist. "Zaria enjoys community engagement," he said with a controlled smile. "But large-scale growth depends on disciplined execution." The conversation paused. His words did not dismiss her outright. They repositioned her. She felt it immediately. The founders glanced between them, unsure whether to respond. "I presented those hiring projections at the board review," she said calmly. "Yes," he replied, still smiling. "With guidance from our executive team." "Guidance." She held his gaze for a second longer than usual. The lake shimmered behind them. Laughter from other guests floated across the dock. Everything appeared seamless from a distance. But the pattern had become clearer. Her role was shifting from partner to supporting figure. Not abruptly. Gradually. That evening, as they drove home, Dmitri spoke about future acquisitions in Minnesota. "You should scale back your direct involvement," he said. "Focus on philanthropy. It suits you." The suggestion sounded like a strategy. It felt like a limitation. The correction came during winter. A fundraising dinner in St. Paul filled a historic ballroom with state officials, nonprofit leaders, and executives from across Minnesota. Crystal chandeliers reflected off polished floors. Cameras lined the back wall. Zaria had prepared remarks about workforce access and long-term investment. She stood beside Dmitri at their assigned table, reviewing note cards once more before the host announced their company's contribution. When her name was called to speak, applause followed. She stepped onto the stage with steady composure. "Volkov Systems entered Minnesota with a commitment to shared growth," she began. "Our expansion model prioritizes." Dmitri rose from his seat. The movement alone drew attention. He crossed the ballroom floor with measured confidence and joined her at the podium. "We prioritize disciplined infrastructure," he said, interrupting gently but firmly. "Operational strength must come first." A few guests exchanged glances. Zaria paused, allowing him to finish. He adjusted the microphone slightly, then added, "Community programs are important, but growth requires structure." The distinction was subtle, but public. She reclaimed the microphone without visible frustration. "As I was saying," she continued evenly, "structure and community are not opposites." Applause returned, though lighter. When they resumed their seats, she leaned toward him. "You undermined my remarks." He kept his gaze forward. "I clarified them." Across the ballroom, conversations resumed. From a distance they appeared aligned, but beneath the polished surface, a line had been crossed. For the first time, the admiration surrounding them felt conditional. And Zaria understood something quietly. This was not a partnership anymore. Control rarely arrives loudly. It settles in through tone, through timing, through who speaks last in a room. By the fourth year in Minnesota, the adjustments to Zaria's role were no longer occasional. They were routine. At weekly executive meetings in the North Loop headquarters, Dmitri began summarizing her reports before she finished presenting them. If she referenced community metrics, he redirected the focus toward expansion speed. If she outlined risk concerns, he reframed them as caution slowing progress. Each shift was small. Each shift was public. The executives seated around the long glass table responded to his cues. They took notes when he spoke. They waited when he paused. When she resumed, attention had already shifted. Zaria noticed how often Dmitri used the phrase, "Let me simplify that." It sounded helpful. It felt diminishing. After one meeting, she remained behind to collect her notes. Two senior managers exited quietly, avoiding direct eye contact. Their discomfort was visible. In the elevator, she studied her reflection in the mirrored wall. Her posture remained upright. Her voice had not cracked during the presentation, yet something internal felt slightly displaced. At home that evening, she reviewed the same slides alone. Her analysis had been accurate. Her projections had been precise. But accuracy did not protect against subtle dismissal. Over time, repetition shapes perception, and perception shapes authority. By late autumn, the pattern had become predictable. When she spoke, he followed. When she proposed, he corrected. When she succeeded, he reframed. Not aggressively, consistently. The embarrassment did not erupt all at once. It accumulated. At a quarterly review session, Zaria presented updated hiring metrics tied to Minnesota University partnerships. The numbers showed measurable gains. Several departments exceeded projections. She finished speaking and looked toward the head of the table. Dmitri tapped his pen once against a legal pad. "These figures are promising," he said. Though they remain secondary to operational output, a few executives nodded automatically. She kept her expression neutral. "Hiring strategy affects operational output." He gave a brief smile. "In theory," the room shifted slightly. It was not open disagreement. It was positioning. After the meeting, one junior analyst approached her near the hallway. "I thought your proposal was strong," he said quietly. Before she could respond, Dmitri stepped out of his office. "Zaria," he called, tone controlled but firm. "We need alignment before presenting future projections." The analyst stepped aside immediately. Inside the office, the door closed. "You cannot contradict financial priorities in front of the board," Dmitri said. "I did not contradict," she replied. "I supported it with data. You supported your perspective." The distinction cut sharper than volume would have. Outside the glass walls, employees pretended not to notice. Embarrassment grows differently when witnesses are present. It does not require shouting. It requires timing. By the time she returned to her desk, the message had traveled. Not through gossip, through body language. When she walked past clusters of staff, conversations paused slightly longer than before. Confidence does not disappear overnight. It erodes in moments like this. Isolation followed quietly. Invitations that once included her began arriving addressed solely to Dmitri. Strategic planning dinners, investor briefings, closed-door advisory sessions. When she asked about one such meeting scheduled at a private club near downtown Minneapolis, he answered without looking up from his tablet. "It's technical," he said. "You would not enjoy it." She held his gaze. "I helped negotiate 2 of the contracts on that agenda." "Yes," he replied evenly. "At the introduction stage." Again, that word. Introduction. Not strategy, not structure. The distinction narrowed her presence without removing it completely. At the next board gathering, her seat remained at the table, but the discussion moved around her rather than through her. Dmitri fielded questions directly. When she attempted to clarify a point about state tax adjustments, he responded before she finished. "We have that handled," he said. The phrase landed softly, handled, as though she required management rather than collaboration. Later that evening, standing alone near the office window, she watched snow fall across the North Loop rooftops. She replayed conversations in her mind, searching for moments she might have misread. There were none. The pattern was consistent. At home, she suggested scheduling a separate strategy session to realign roles. Dmitri set down his glass slowly. "You are overthinking," he said. "Public presence does not equal control." She understood then. Control was the point, and it was being exercised in plain sight. By early winter, public criticism no longer surprised her. It arrived almost on schedule. During a planning session for a North Loop expansion dinner, Zaria reviewed guest seating charts in Dmitri's office. She suggested placing 2 local founders beside a state commissioner to strengthen upcoming negotiations. Dmitri glanced over the layout. "We will seat them according to capital influence," he said, "not familiarity." "Relationships influence capital," she replied evenly. He closed the folder. "You focus on optics," he said. "I focus on leverage." The comment was delivered without a raised voice. Yet the division was absolute. Later that evening, as they prepared for the executive dinner, she selected a fitted navy dress suitable for a formal setting. She paused briefly in front of the mirror, adjusting a silver bracelet. Dmitri entered the room and studied her reflection. "You are overdressed," he said. "Keep it simpler. This is not a charity gala." The remark was not about color or fabric. It was about presentation. She changed into a darker, more understated dress without responding. In the private dining room overlooking the North Loop skyline, executives gathered around a long polished table. Conversations moved easily at first. Wine was poured. Contracts were discussed. Halfway through the second course, one executive asked Zaria about workforce expansion timelines. She began to answer. Dmitri leaned back in his chair. "Allow me," he said. The interruption felt automatic now. Routine. Guests lowered their eyes toward their plates. The dessert plates had just been cleared when the final shift occurred. One of the senior investors, an older executive from Minneapolis, turned towards Zaria with polite interest. "I read your early proposal on community hiring," he said. "It positioned Volkov Systems favorably with the state." She opened her mouth to respond. Dmitri laughed softly. "Those were early drafts," he said. "We refined them substantially." The investor smiled uncertainly. Still, the groundwork mattered. Dmitri glanced at Zaria briefly, then back at the table. "Groundwork is easy," he replied. "Execution requires discipline." A few guests shifted in their seats. The conversation moved toward future acquisitions, but the energy had altered. Near the end of the evening, as coffee was poured, Dmitri studied her again across the table. "You seem distracted tonight," he said, loud enough for several executives to hear. "Perhaps the spotlight suits you less than you think." Silence fell quickly. Zaria felt every pair of eyes lower. Her breathing slowed deliberately. "I am focused," she answered. He tilted his head slightly. "Then try presenting with more confidence next time," he added. "Appearance influences perception." The implication lingered. Not sharp, not shouted, but unmistakable. Across the table, one executive avoided looking up. Another adjusted his cufflinks as if the gesture required urgent attention. Humiliation does not always come with volume. Sometimes it arrives disguised as advice. Zaria held her posture steady, but something inside her shifted permanently. Control had moved from subtle correction to open commentary, and the line between partnership and performance had disappeared. The ballroom overlooking downtown Minneapolis shimmered in gold light. It was Dmitri's 40th birthday. Investors filled the private dining hall. Senior executives from North Loop, state partners from St. Paul. A string quartet played softly near the glass wall, where the skyline stretched across the dark winter sky. Crystal glasses reflected chandelier light. Silver cutlery rested precisely aligned. Zaria stood beside Dmitri near the center table as guests finished the main course. She wore a structured black gown, minimal jewelry, controlled elegance. Everything about the evening signaled success. Dmitri raised his glass. "To expansion," he said. "To Minnesota growth, to loyalty." Applause followed. He thanked his board. He praised key investors. He referenced major contracts secured during the year. He did not mention her. Zaria noticed, but she remained composed. As dessert was served, one investor called out, "You should thank your wife. She has been visible at every milestone." A few guests agreed. Dmitri smiled thinly. "Yes," he said slowly. "Zaria has supported many of our efforts." Supported. The word lingered like a correction. He turned toward her. "Why don't you say something?" he added, handing her the microphone. She hesitated only briefly before stepping forward. The room quieted. She began to speak about partnership, shared vision, and long-term stability in Minnesota markets. Halfway through her remarks, Dmitri shifted beside her. She felt it before she saw it. Dmitri reached for the microphone. The movement was smooth, confident, practiced. "Let me clarify something," he said, interrupting her mid-sentence. A few guests exchanged glances. Zaria lowered her hand slowly. Dmitri faced the room. "Partnership is valuable," he continued, "but leadership requires decisiveness. Growth does not happen through sentiment." The phrasing sounded like strategy. It felt like a correction. She stood beside him, expression steady. He placed a light hand at her back, a gesture that looked supportive from a distance. Up close, it felt possessive. "Zaria's strength lies in community presence," he added. "Operational execution is my responsibility." Silence followed. Crystal glasses hovered halfway to lips. Forks paused above dessert plates. She felt disbelief first. Not anger, not hurt. Disbelief that this was unfolding in a room filled with cameras and investors. He stepped slightly ahead of her. occupying the center position beneath the chandelier light. "And since we are speaking honestly tonight," he said, voice calm, "clarity matters in all areas of life." The room grew still. Zaria's pulse slowed rather than accelerated. Her mind sharpened. She understood something instinctively. This was not improvisation. This was planned. The skyline glowed behind them through the glass wall. Snow fell lightly across downtown Minneapolis, visible under streetlights below. Dmitri adjusted his cufflinks. "I believe transparency serves everyone," he continued. She looked at him fully now. Waiting. Dmitri did not lower his voice. "I have filed for divorce," he said. The words landed without warning. A fork slipped from someone's hand and struck porcelain. A glass paused mid-air. The quartet near the window stopped playing. For a moment, the room did not breathe. Zaria heard the sentence clearly. Filed. Divorce. Her mind did not reject it. It catalogued it. Around her, investors shifted in their seats. One executive whispered something under his breath. A state official looked toward the exit as if uncertain whether to remain. Dmitri continued, composed. "Personal alignment must reflect professional direction," he said. "This decision ensures focus moving forward." He spoke as if announcing a restructuring, not the end of a marriage. Zaria felt disbelief pass through her like cold water. No prior discussion that morning. No private warning before dinner. Only the microphone. Only witnesses. She studied his posture. Straight spine, measured tone, complete control. He had chosen the setting carefully. High profile, recorded, public. Across the ballroom, camera phones lifted discreetly. Her heartbeat remained steady. Emotion attempted to surface. Shock, embarrassment, anger. Instead, something else arrived. Clarity. He wanted a reaction. Tears would validate his dominance. Outrage would confirm instability. Silence would unsettle him. She stepped forward and took the microphone back without force. The room watched closely. The skyline beyond the glass remained indifferent. The microphone felt cool in her hand. Zaria did not look at the guests first. She looked at Dmitri. Then she turned toward the room. "Thank you for your honesty," she said evenly. Her tone did not rise. It did not tremble. A few heads lifted slightly, as if recalibrating. She continued. "I was not informed of this filing prior to tonight. However, I respect clarity." A ripple of surprise moved through the tables. Dmitri's jaw tightened, almost imperceptibly. She kept her posture upright. "Marriage deserves private conversation," she added. "But since this has been made public, I will respond publicly." The words were deliberate, measured, no accusation, no display. She shifted her gaze briefly toward the skyline, then back to the audience. "I value dignity," she said, "and I intend to handle this matter with composure." The statement held weight, without confrontation. Across the room, executives avoided direct eye contact with Dmitri now. The power dynamic had shifted by a fraction. He had expected visible collapse. Instead, he faced control. Crystal glasses remained untouched. The air felt still but alert. She handed the microphone back to him gently. "I hope your next chapter reflects the discipline you value," she concluded. Polite, contained, strategic. The quartet remained silent. The silence itself now carried authority. Dmitri hesitated before accepting the microphone. For the first time that evening, uncertainty flickered across his expression. No one resumed eating. The staff stood motionless near the walls, unsure whether to clear plates or wait for direction. Dmitri lifted the microphone again, but the rhythm of the room had shifted. His earlier certainty felt thinner now. "This decision is final," he said. "It is necessary." Zaria watched him without expression. Necessary. He had chosen the word carefully. Necessary for growth. Necessary for focus. Necessary for control. But the room no longer absorbed his tone the same way. A senior investor near the front cleared his throat. "This is unexpected," he said cautiously. Dmitri nodded once. "Transitions often are." He placed the microphone down on the podium and stepped back. From a distance, he still looked composed. Tall, immaculate suit, shoulders squared, yet something intangible had altered. Zaria stepped slightly forward again, though she did not request the microphone this time. I will be filing my own response in Hennepin County, she said calmly, projecting her voice without amplification. And I will protect what I helped build. No volume, no aggression, just clarity. Several guests exchanged looks that no longer favored him automatically. The quartet resumed playing softly, uncertainly. A violin trembled through the first note. Zaria returned to her seat without haste. Her face revealed nothing. Inside, disbelief had settled into stillness. Emotion had shut down to preserve focus. The birthday dinner continued in fragments. But the marriage had ended in a single controlled announcement. And Dmitri understood something too late. She had not broken. The morning after the birthday dinner, Minneapolis felt colder than usual. Zaria stood alone in the penthouse living room, sunlight reflecting off fresh snow along the riverfront below. The skyline looked unchanged. Her life was not. Dmitri had already left for the North Loop office before she woke. No conversation, no explanation beyond the announcement. On the kitchen counter, a folder rested neatly aligned. Settlement proposal. She opened it without hesitation. The terms were precise. Generous on the surface, a structured payout, temporary residence rights, limited access to certain joint holdings, and one critical clause, waiver of claim to Minnesota trust assets. Her eyes moved slowly across the lines. The same trust referenced in the filing, the same properties she had helped secure, lakefront real estate, commercial spaces, development projects. The document framed the offer as protection. It was containment. She felt fear briefly, not of losing comfort, of losing recognition for what she built. If she signed, the public narrative would solidify. Supportive spouse exits quietly. Russian billionaire retains primary holdings. Her phone buzzed with messages from advisors urging discretion. Protect your peace. Avoid litigation. Accept dignity. She closed the folder. Clarity formed not as anger but as alignment. She had invested years into Minnesota expansion, negotiated state partnerships, structured early property acquisitions. Those contributions were not ceremonial. They were documented. Fear lingered. Litigation meant exposure, media scrutiny, board pressure. But surrender meant erasure. She picked up her phone and dialed a number she had saved months earlier. An independent Minnesota attorney. The law office overlooked the Mississippi River, its wide windows framing frozen water and slow-moving barges cutting through ice. The space felt deliberate, quiet, structured. Zaria sat across from Marianne Keller, a Minnesota attorney known for high-asset litigation, no connection to Volkov Systems, no ties to Dmitri's board. Independence mattered. Marianne reviewed the settlement packet carefully, page by page. She did not rush. She did not comment immediately. When she finished, she folded her hands. This proposal assumes you will avoid public contest, she said. It offers comfort in exchange for silence. Zaria nodded. I will not sign it, she replied. The words carried more weight than volume. Marianne leaned forward slightly. If you reject this, you must prepare for scrutiny, financial discovery, media pressure, possible reputation attacks. Fear surfaced again, not of courtrooms, of narrative control. Dmitri understood public optics. He had shaped them for years. What are the trust structures tied to these properties? Zaria asked. Marianne slid a legal pad closer. Based on preliminary filings, the Minnesota Property Trust was amended 18 months ago. You are listed as a prior consenting party. I never consented, Zaria said evenly. Then we challenge validity. That requires forensic accounting and full disclosure. The decision moved from emotional to procedural. Reject settlement. Initiate independent audit. File counterpetition in Hennepin County. Zaria inhaled once. I want a full review of every state asset transfer in the last 3 years, she said. Marianne nodded. Then we begin immediately. Outside the window, sunlight struck the river's surface. Inside, fear began converting into strategy. By late afternoon, the penthouse felt less like a home and more like contested territory. Zaria returned briefly to gather personal documents. She moved methodically through drawers and file cabinets, scanning contracts she had once reviewed alongside Dmitri. Property acquisition agreements, board expansion records, email threads confirming negotiation milestones. Her contributions were traceable. She paused at a folder labeled Minnesota Trust Amendments.
The settlement offer looked generous, but buried inside were trust amendments. She rejected the offer. This was the decision.
She paused at a folder labeled Minnesota Trust Amendments. The date printed on the cover matched the document she had received anonymously the day before. She opened it carefully. Inside were copies of internal memos referencing asset protection strategies during periods of marital instability. Her name appeared in footnotes. Without context, without signature acknowledgement, she felt fear sharpen again. Not because the documents existed, because they had been prepared in anticipation. Someone had forecasted this outcome. Her phone rang. "Marianne, we initiated preliminary records requests," the attorney said. "There are irregularities in transfer timing. Certain properties were moved into subsidiary holdings 2 weeks before your public appearances at major state events." Zaria closed her eyes briefly. "Public praise, private repositioning, freeze any additional restructuring," she said. "We are filing notice," Marianne replied. "But expect resistance." Resistance did not intimidate her. Obscurity did. If she walked away now, the record would stand unchallenged. If she fought, the record would be examined. She looked around the living room once more. The skyline reflected off the windows. This had once symbolized shared ambition. Now it marked division. She zipped her document folder closed. The internal struggle was ending. Resolve was replacing hesitation. 2 days later, Zaria sat again in Marianne's office, overlooking the Mississippi River. This time, the wood desk was covered in printed spreadsheets. Property transfers, trust amendments, subsidiary registrations filed in Minnesota over the last 36 months. Marianne circled 3 entries with a pen. "These holdings were moved into layered entities," she said. "Each step legal on the surface. But the timing aligns with major public milestones tied to your involvement." Zaria studied the dates. Lake Minnetonka estate transferred into holding company. North Loop commercial space reassigned. St. Paul development rights adjusted. All within weeks of events where she publicly represented the company. They insulated assets while preserving image, Marianne continued. If challenged, they will argue strategic restructuring. Fear no longer dominated her thoughts. What replaced it was precision. "How long will full discovery take?" Zaria asked. "Months," Marianne replied. "And it will be public." Public scrutiny meant headlines, board commentary, speculation about motives. But quiet withdrawal meant permanent omission from the record. Zaria leaned back slightly. "I reject the settlement formally," she said. "File counter petition. Demand full disclosure of Minnesota holdings and trust governance." Marianne nodded once. "This changes tone," she said. "From negotiation to litigation." "Yes," Zaria answered. "It does." Outside, the river moved slowly beneath winter light. Inside, the turning point solidified. She was no longer reacting. She was initiating. The counterpetition was filed in Hennepin County before the end of the week. News outlets updated their headlines again. Divorce dispute escalates. Asset challenge filed. Dimitri's legal team responded within hours, issuing a brief statement about protecting corporate integrity. Zaria expected resistance. What she did not expect was the next discovery. Late that evening, Marianne called. "We received preliminary bank trace reports," she said. "There were transfers routed through a Minnesota-based subsidiary tied to the North Loop expansion." Zaria listened carefully. "The amounts were significant," Marianne continued, "and the authorization signatures appeared digitally certified under your credentials." Silence settled. "I did not authorize those transfers," Zaria said calmly. "We know," Marianne replied, "but this deepens the case. If your credentials were used without consent, that is material." Zaria stared at the Mississippi River from her apartment window. Ice drifted slowly along the current. The legal dispute was no longer confined to property division. It involved documentation integrity, financial authentication, intent. "This will widen discovery," Marianne added, "possibly into internal executive communications," which meant exposure, board members, private emails, strategic memos. The battle had shifted from personal to structural. Zaria felt clarity fully replaced fear. "Proceed," she said. Request complete internal transfer logs for all Minnesota subsidiaries. She ended the call and stood still for several seconds. The midpoint had arrived. She had chosen litigation over a quiet exit, chosen record over reputation protection, chosen visibility over comfort. Would you fight quietly or walk away peacefully? Share your choice below. The morning after the counter-petition became public, Volkov Systems released a statement from its North Loop headquarters. Corporate stability remains unaffected. Leadership structure unchanged. Operations continue as planned. Dmitry stood before cameras in a tailored charcoal suit, the Minneapolis skyline visible behind him through the glass tower windows. He appeared composed, controlled, unbothered. The divorce proceedings are personal, he said evenly. They will not interfere with company performance. Investors watched closely. Analysts tracked market movement. Board members exchanged quiet messages. Inside her temporary office suite, Zaria watched the broadcast without expression. He was doing what he did best, consolidating control, reassuring markets, projecting certainty. Her name was mentioned only once, a private dispute. She did not react publicly. Instead, she reviewed updated forensic summaries Marianne had sent overnight, digital authentication trails, transfer sequences, layered subsidiaries across Minnesota property holdings. Her approach differed from his. He managed perception. She gathered evidence. Strategic calm replaced emotional urgency. The battle was no longer about announcement or spectacle. It was about documentation. Outside, snow pressed against the windows as a winter storm moved across Minneapolis. Visibility decreased. Inside, her focus sharpened. She drafted a formal request for full board minutes covering the past 3 fiscal years. If asset insulation strategies had been discussed internally, she wanted a record. Dmitry assumed visible authority. She concentrated on leverage. The glass tower boardroom felt colder than usual. Snow swept sideways against the wide windows, blurring the Minneapolis skyline into pale shapes. Inside, the long conference table reflected muted overhead light. Senior board members gathered in measured silence. Dmitry stood at the head of the table. "We maintain focus," he said. "The divorce is separate from corporate structure." His voice carried authority. Graphs projected onto the screen showed stable revenue lines. Expansion schedules remained intact. Public messaging emphasized continuity. One board member asked, "Will the legal dispute affect subsidiary governance?" Dmitry's response came without pause. No operational impact. He controlled the tone. He controlled the sequence. He controlled framing. Across the river, Zaria met with Marianne and a financial analyst specializing in corporate governance disputes. Papers covered the wood desk again. Emails obtained through preliminary discovery showed internal conversations, referencing asset insulation during domestic uncertainty. The phrase was clinical, calculated. "Board awareness is implied here," the analyst said, tapping a highlighted section. They discussed restructuring timing. Zaria read carefully. Not accusation, not confession, but acknowledgement. "They knew," she said quietly. Marianne nodded. If they were informed, they now face exposure, which shifted pressure, not from public perception, from fiduciary responsibility. Zaria leaned forward. "Request certified copies of all governance votes tied to trust amendments," she said. The storm outside intensified. Inside both rooms, different strategies unfolded. Dmitry projected steadiness. Zaria prepared precision. Control and leverage moving in opposite directions. 3 days later, a formal letter arrived from Volkov Systems Corporate Counsel. Request for private discussion, not a settlement offer. A meeting. The board wished to clarify governance misunderstandings. Zaria read the letter twice. This was not courtesy. This was pressure. She imagined the glass tower boardroom again. Snowstorm outside. Executives seated in a controlled semicircle. Dmitry at the head. He assumed she would hesitate. Instead, she confirmed attendance. The meeting was scheduled for late afternoon. When she entered the building, employees glanced discreetly in her direction. Some offered restrained nods. Others avoided eye contact entirely. Inside the boardroom, the atmosphere felt muted. The skyline behind the glass appeared pale beneath lingering snow. Dmitry did not greet her. A senior board member spoke first. "We are concerned about the direction of litigation," he said. "Extended discovery could damage corporate valuation." Zaria sat upright, hands folded neatly on the table. "I am concerned about documentation integrity," she replied. The room stilled. Another member added, "These matters are sensitive." "They are factual," she answered calmly. Dmitri finally spoke. "You are escalating unnecessarily." She turned toward him. "I am requesting transparency." Silence followed. The board members exchanged looks. This was no longer framed as marital conflict. It was corporate accountability. Outside, snow drifted slowly down the glass. Inside, confidence rebuilt quietly. She was no longer reacting. She was positioning. The discussion lasted over an hour. Board members avoided direct accusation, but their concern was clear. Discovery would open internal communications. Governance procedures would be examined. Investors might question timing decisions. One director leaned forward. "If this proceeds publicly, the media will analyze asset transfers alongside marital conflict." Zaria held his gaze. "Then accuracy matters." Dmitri exhaled softly. "You are placing corporate stability at risk." "I am protecting my legal rights," she replied. Strategic calm steadied her voice. He assumed authority would silence her. Instead, authority now required negotiation. Another board member asked carefully, "What outcome are you seeking?" "Full disclosure of Minnesota trust restructuring," she said, "and correction of unauthorized digital certifications." The phrase unsettled the room. Unauthorized certification. The financial analyst beside her slid a document across the table. Highlighted timestamps, transfer authorizations tied to her credentials while she was physically present at public events. The implication required no dramatics. Dmitri's expression remained composed, but tension flickered briefly in his jaw. Snow streaked diagonally across the windows behind him. Muted conversation followed among directors. They were recalculating risk. If documentation showed internal knowledge, liability extended beyond marriage. Power had begun redirecting, not through volume, through exposure. A senior board member cleared his throat. "We may need separate counsel." The statement carried weight. Separate from Dmitri, separate from unified defense. Control was fragmenting. By the end of the week, internal dynamics shifted further. 2 Minnesota board members requested a confidential session without Dmitri present. The message reached Zaria through Marianne late that evening. "They want to speak privately," Marianne said. "Off record." Zaria stood near the window of her apartment, city lights reflecting faintly across the river below. "About liability?" she asked. "Likely," Marianne replied. "And about governance awareness." The request itself revealed pressure. If board members sought separation from Dmitri's legal posture, confidence in his control had weakened. The private meeting was scheduled at a smaller downtown conference suite, not the main North Loop Tower. No press, no corporate branding, muted carpeted hallway, neutral walls, frosted glass door. Inside, 2 directors waited. "We need clarity," one said once the door closed. "Were you aware of digital certifications tied to those transfers?" "No," Zaria answered evenly. "And I can prove my location on each date." They exchanged a look. "This could expose governance oversight failures," the second director admitted quietly. Zaria did not press. Silence often invites admission. Outside the suite, Minneapolis traffic moved steadily beneath gray winter light. Inside, leverage shifted further. Dmitri still controlled headlines, but the board now questioned the internal process. Corporate pressure had begun to turn inward. When she left the building, her phone vibrated again. Another message from Marianne. "There may be additional transfers tied to a secondary holding entity," she said. "We just found the reference." The case was expanding. The first shift appeared online. A Minneapolis business columnist published a measured analysis questioning the timing of recent asset transfers within Volkov systems. The article did not accuse. It did not speculate wildly. It asked questions. Why were multiple Minnesota properties reassigned within weeks of high-profile public events? Why did digital certifications trace back to shared executive credentials? By mid-morning, the piece circulated across professional networks. Zaria read it from her apartment, sunlight reflecting across the Mississippi River outside her window. The tone surprised her. It did not frame her as a disgruntled spouse. It framed her as a stakeholder. Validation arrived quietly. Local commentators began referencing her documented involvement in early Minnesota expansion. Archived footage resurfaced showing her negotiating state partnerships. Quotes from prior interviews emphasized strategic insight. Public curiosity grew, not about the divorce itself, about governance. At the North Loop headquarters, Dmitry maintained his routine. Meetings, forecast reviews, controlled messaging. But analysts on financial panels now included phrases like documentation integrity and subsidiary layering. The narrative was widening. Inside her legal team's office, Marianne slid another article across the desk. "This is no longer about spectacle," she said. "It is about process." Zaria nodded. Controlled empowerment felt different from emotional vindication. She did not celebrate. She recalibrated. If the public conversation moved toward structural accountability, she needed precision in every statement. Outside, Minneapolis traffic moved steadily under pale winter light. The city was watching more closely now. By the end of the week, digital boards across downtown Minneapolis rotated new headlines. Asset transfers questioned in Volkov divorce case. Governance oversight under review. Television panels dissected financial structures rather than marital tension. Legal analysts explained trust amendments in calm, technical language. Her name appeared beside terms like stakeholder and CO negotiator. Public curiosity intensified. Zaria stepped into a small cafe near the river one afternoon, and conversations quieted slightly when she entered. Not with hostility, with interest. Two women seated near the window whispered, then one approached her. "We saw the reports," she said softly. "You represented Minnesota. Well." The comment was simple, but it carried weight. Validation no longer came from corporate circles. It came from community perception. Meanwhile, inside the penthouse, Dmitry watched a financial news segment replay the original birthday announcement clip. The footage now included side-by-side analysis of property transfer dates. His posture remained rigid as commentators debated executive transparency. He muted the television, but did not turn it off. At her attorney's office, Marianne placed a printed email on the table. "A local news outlet is preparing a feature," she said. "They are requesting background clarification from your legal team." Zaria considered the implications. Public engagement required control, not emotion. "We respond in writing," she said. With documentation. Empowerment did not require volume. It required evidence. Outside, light from studio towers flickered on as evening approached. Minneapolis was paying attention. The invitation arrived the following morning. Twin Cities Public Network requested an exclusive interview. Not a tabloid. Not a sensational program. A respected local outlet known for policy discussions and business analysis. The email outlined the focus clearly. Governance transparency. Asset restructuring. Digital authorization practices. Not personal grievances. Zaria read the message twice before forwarding it to Marianne. "This changes visibility," Marianne said during their call. "If you speak, do so with discipline. No emotional framing. Only facts." Zaria agreed. Public curiosity had created space, but space required careful movement. The studio was located near downtown Minneapolis, its exterior understated. Inside, soft lighting panels illuminated a clean backdrop displaying the city skyline. She arrived early. Reviewed prepared documentation once more. Transfer dates, signature authentication logs, board governance timelines. Across the city, Dmitry received notification of the scheduled interview. He stood alone in the penthouse living room, television screen reflecting muted news previews. His expression did not shift, but his grip on the remote tightened briefly. Inside the studio makeup room, Zaria looked at her reflection. Not as a wife, not as a defendant, as a stakeholder. When the producer entered, she offered a calm smile. "We appreciate your willingness to speak," the producer said. Zaria nodded. "I am here to clarify the process," she replied. Controlled empowerment settled firmly. This was no longer a reaction. It was positioning. The studio lights warmed the room without glare. Zaria sat across from the host at a polished glass table. Behind them, a large screen displayed a muted image of downtown Minneapolis at dusk. The host began carefully. Recent filings in Hennepin County reference Minnesota property trusts and digital certifications tied to executive accounts. Can you clarify your position? Zaria folded her hands lightly on the table. My position is simple, she said. I am requesting documentation review and full disclosure of asset transfers made during our marriage. The tone remained steady. No accusation, no dramatics. The host continued. Were you aware of the trust amendments at the time they were executed? No, she answered. And that is why legal discovery matters. A graphic appeared briefly on the screen behind them, showing a timeline of property transfers. Public curiosity now had structure. The discussion focused on governance practices, executive accountability, and documentation safeguards. Midway through the segment, the host paused. Many viewers are following this closely, she said. What would you say to those watching? Zaria looked directly toward the camera. If this story resonates, she said calmly, subscribe for more long-form stories about strength and dignity. The statement felt intentional, not promotional, aligned. She returned her focus to the host. This is about protecting accurate records, she added. Outside the studio, Minneapolis traffic moved steadily under evening light. Inside, the narrative continued shifting. The segment aired that evening. Clips circulated quickly across Minnesota news platforms. Headlines shifted tone again. Executive requests transparency in asset dispute. Governance review expands beyond divorce. The focus had moved decisively. Commentators replayed her calm responses, beside graphics outlining property transfer timelines. Legal experts emphasized digital authorization standards. Board accountability entered the conversation openly. Inside the North Loop Tower, executives watched the coverage in muted conference rooms. Conversations grew quieter, measured. At the penthouse, Dmitry stood near the floor-to-ceiling windows as the interview replayed on television. The city lights reflected against the glass, blending with the studio image on screen. He listened to her words about documentation integrity, about disclosure, about process. There were no emotional accusations to dismiss, only facts. Across the river, Zaria reviewed messages from community leaders and former partners. Support arrived not as praise, but as acknowledgement. You handled it well. Stay precise. Keep pushing for clarity. Public curiosity had matured into informed attention. The shift was undeniable. Late that night, her phone buzzed again. A new message from the same network. They were preparing a follow-up segment, this time with expanded financial analysis, and they wanted extended time on air. The invitation signaled something larger. The story was not fading. It was deepening. Hennepin County Family Court felt smaller than the ballroom where the marriage had ended. Wood, paneled walls, muted lighting, winter coats draped across the backs of benches as attendees settled into place. Outside, snow pressed softly against courthouse windows. Zaria sat beside Marianne at the front table. Across the aisle, Dmitry conferred quietly with his legal team. His posture remained upright, controlled. His jaw tightened briefly when he noticed media observers seated along the back wall. The judge entered. Everyone stood. When proceedings began, the language shifted from public speculation to formal record. Marianne presented opening arguments clearly. Your Honor, we seek full examination of Minnesota trust amendments executed during the marriage, including digital certifications applied without verified consent. No dramatics, only documentation. Dmitry's counsel responded with a measured tone. The restructuring followed standard corporate protocol, he argued. There was no intent to mislead. Intent would become central. As exhibits were introduced, printed transfer logs appeared on courtroom monitors. Dates aligned with public appearances Zaria had made on behalf of the company. The pattern emerged visually. Event, transfer, certification, event, transfer. Zaria remained steady. Steady courage does not announce itself. It holds posture when numbers appear on a screen. Across the aisle, Dmitry avoided her gaze. Exposure had begun. The forensic accountant took the stand next. He spoke in precise terms, referencing digital timestamp authentication and layered subsidiary transfers tied to Minnesota holdings. A large monitor displayed side-by-side comparisons. Left column, public events, where Zaria represented Volkov Systems. Right column, property trust amendments filed within days of those appearances. The alignment was difficult to ignore. Were these certifications executed from Mrs. Volkov's registered device? Marianne asked. No, the accountant replied. Metadata indicates remote authorization through an executive administrative portal. A murmur moved quietly across the courtroom benches. Winter coats shifted as observers leaned forward. Dimitri's counsel objected to phrasing, but the judge allowed the explanation to continue. Was Mrs. Volkov notified of these amendments? Marianne asked. There is no documented confirmation of notification, the accountant answered. Zaria felt the weight of exposure settle fully into the room. This was no longer narrative. It was record. Across the aisle, Dimitri's jaw tightened again, though his posture remained composed. His attorney attempted to redirect. Corporate restructuring often involves delegated authority, he said. This does not imply misconduct, but the pattern displayed on the screen suggested more than routine delegation. It suggested insulation. The judge leaned slightly forward, reviewing printed copies placed before her. Continue, she said calmly. Steady courage requires patience. Zaria did not interrupt. She did not react outwardly. She let documentation speak. Marianne stood again, moving carefully through printed exhibits. Your Honor, we submit board minutes from the North Loop headquarters meeting dated 18 months ago. Copies were distributed to the bench and opposing counsel. Highlighted text marked a discussion of asset insulation during domestic uncertainty. The phrase hung in the courtroom without theatrics. Dimitri's attorney rose quickly. This language refers to risk management, not marital positioning. Marianne remained composed. Then why were the trust amendments executed within days of Mrs. Volkov's public representation of these same properties? Silence followed. The judge studied the timeline. Winter light filtered faintly through high windows, casting a pale glow across the wood surfaces. Zaria kept her breathing measured. Measured strength is quiet. It waits for alignment. Another document appeared on the monitor. A digital certification log showing her credentials used during a period when she was documented speaking at a St. Paul fundraising event. Her physical presence was recorded on video at the exact timestamp of the transfer. The alignment was precise. Across the aisle, Dimitri leaned slightly toward his attorney, whispering something under his breath. The judge lifted her gaze. Counsel, she said, addressing Dimitri's legal team. How do you explain this authentication overlap? The courtroom held still. Exposure had reached its peak. Dimitri's attorney adjusted his glasses before responding. Your Honor, executive credentials can be accessed by authorized administrative staff. This does not establish intent. The explanation sounded procedural, but the judge's expression did not soften. Was Mrs. Volkov informed me that her credentials were being used for trust amendments? She asked. There is no direct written confirmation, the attorney admitted. The admission carried weight. Marianne stepped forward slightly. We are not alleging clerical error, she said. We are establishing a pattern. Minnesota properties were reassigned while Mrs. Volkov publicly reinforced their value. Her digital identity authorized transfers she did not execute. The courtroom remained silent. Even the faint shuffle of papers had stopped. Exposure now stood in plain record. The judge requested clarification on board awareness. One of the previously submitted minutes was read aloud. Asset repositioning during domestic uncertainty. The phrase echoed differently in a courtroom than in a boardroom. Across the aisle, Dimitri's jaw tightened again, though he maintained upright posture. Measured strength does not celebrate turning points. It recognizes them. Zaria kept her eyes forward. No satisfaction, only steadiness. The judge leaned back slightly in her chair. I will review these exhibits thoroughly before ruling on asset division, she said. Her tone remained neutral, but the pause that followed carried consequence. The courtroom remained silent for several seconds after the judge finished speaking. I will take this under advisement, she said. A ruling on the contested Minnesota trust assets will be issued after full review of the submitted documentation. The words were measured. Not decisive, not final, but significant. Winter coats shifted along the benches as observers processed what they had heard. Reporters began typing carefully, aware that phrasing now mattered. Dmitri remained seated for a moment longer than expected before rising. His expression stayed controlled, but tension lingered along his jawline. Zaria stood beside Marianne without visible reaction. Exposure had occurred. Digital certifications examined. Board language read into record. Timeline alignments displayed in court. Financial truth had surfaced publicly. Outside, snow continued falling lightly across downtown Minneapolis. Inside, the judge gathered the exhibits into a neat stack. "This court will notify counsel when a decision is reached," she concluded. The gavel did not strike dramatically. The pause itself was the weight. As attendees filed out, quiet conversations filled the corridor. Some glanced toward Zaria with new recognition. Others avoided Dmitri.
He ended the marriage in public. She rebuilt in public. What began as humiliation became
Zaria with new recognition. Others avoided Dmitri entirely. He exited through a side hallway with his legal team. She walked toward the main doors. Steady courage does not rush. Measured strength does not perform. The ruling had not yet been delivered, but the record had changed. And somewhere between the birthday announcement and this judicial pause, control had shifted permanently. The ruling arrived on a gray Minneapolis morning. Hennepin County granted partial division of the contested Minnesota trust assets pending final financial reconciliation. Digital certification concerns were noted formally in the court's summary. It was not total victory. It was recognition. Zaria read the decision twice in Marianne's office overlooking the Mississippi River. Relief came first, not loud, not triumphant. Relief that the record reflected the truth. Relief that documentation mattered. Marianne leaned back slightly. "This establishes standing," she said. "Future proceedings will reference this finding." Outside, winter light softened the river's surface. Inside, something internal shifted. For months, her identity had been framed as a reaction. Wife responding to public announcement. Spouse challenging asset insulation. Now the record described her as a petitioner with substantiated claims. Release followed slowly. The tension that had lived in her shoulders since the birthday dinner eased. Not fully, but enough. Across the city, Dmitri's legal team issued a restrained statement emphasizing ongoing review. Market analysts adjusted forecasts slightly, but did not signal collapse. Life would continue, but not as before. That afternoon, Zaria returned to the Lake Minnetonka property. Cardboard boxes lined the hallway. The house felt larger than it once had. Quieter, she began sorting documents into separate piles. Personal, corporate, foundation plans. Identity was rearranging itself. The lake house echoed differently once the furniture began disappearing. Movers carried framed artwork past tall windows overlooking frozen water. Shelves that once displayed awards and photographs now stood bare. Zaria worked steadily, folding clothes into labeled boxes. Personal items first, then books, then files she no longer needed. Relief deepened into release, not of memory, of weight. For years, this property had symbolized arrival, expansion into Minnesota, joint ambition, shared visibility. Now it felt like a chapter closing cleanly. She paused near the living room window, watching thin snow drift across the lake's surface. The quiet was not heavy. It was open. Her phone buzzed. A notification from Marianne confirming timeline adjustments for final asset reconciliation. No urgency. No alarm. Process had replaced chaos. Later that afternoon, she drove into downtown Minneapolis to view a small office space near the river. Exposed brick walls. Tall windows. Modest square footage. It was not grand. It was intentional. The leasing agent slid paperwork across a simple desk. "This would be for a nonprofit?" he asked. "Yes," she replied, focused on financial literacy and executive governance awareness. The words felt aligned, not reactive. She signed the preliminary lease agreement with a steady hand. Identity shift does not arrive in speeches. It arrives in decisions. Outside, traffic moved steadily beneath gray skies. Inside, a new direction formed without his shadow. The first snowfall she experienced alone felt different. Not dramatic, not symbolic, just quiet. Zaria stood on the balcony of her new apartment overlooking the Mississippi River as soft flakes gathered along the railing. The city lights reflected faintly against the water below. For the first time in years, no meeting schedule defined her evening. No shared calendar reminder, no expectation to perform partnership in public. Release deepened into clarity. Inside the apartment, unpacked boxes remained stacked near the entryway. She had chosen to move only what mattered. Documents, a few framed photographs, professional journals, minimal furniture, less space, more intention. Earlier that afternoon, she met with 2 local advisors to outline the nonprofit's mission structure, financial literacy, executive accountability education, workshops for women navigating complex asset disputes, not reactive, constructive. The conversation energized her in a way corporate dinners never had. Across town, Dimitri reviewed financial summaries alone in the penthouse. The space felt larger now. Screens displayed market analysis. Legal updates scrolled quietly along the bottom of the television. He paused at a clip replaying her interview segment from weeks earlier. He muted it again. Life without his wealth shadow meant something different for each of them. For her, it meant autonomy. For him, it meant visibility without partnership. Snow continued falling outside both windows. But the silence no longer felt heavy to her. It felt earned. The nonprofit office began to take shape within weeks. A simple sign near the entrance displayed the organization's name in clean lettering. Inside, folding tables held stacks of educational materials. Whiteboards lined one wall, ready for workshops. Zaria stood near the window one afternoon as volunteers arranged chairs for the first small seminar. The space felt different from boardrooms. No glass towers, no executive hierarchy. Just structured conversation. Relief settled deeper. She no longer measured her value through proximity to his title. She measured it through impact. The first session focused on understanding digital authorization safeguards. Attendees listened closely as she explained how executive credentials function and how to protect personal access. Her voice carried authority rooted in experience, not performance. After the session, a woman approached her quietly. "Thank you for speaking openly," she said. "It helps to see someone stand firm." Validation arrived again, not through headlines, through a lived example. Later that evening, as she locked the office door, her phone vibrated. A message from Dimitri. "We should meet privately, Lake Minnetonka, to discuss final terms." She read the message without reacting immediately. The lake house still existed legally as shared property pending final reconciliation. The request carried an implication: personal, private, contained. She looked down at the screen for several seconds before typing a response. She did not call him. She did not hesitate long. Her reply was brief. "All communication will proceed through counsel." She read the sentence once before pressing send. The boundary felt clean, not emotional. Final. Within minutes, his response appeared. "This does not need lawyers. We can resolve this ourselves." She did not answer. Outside her apartment window, snow gathered softly along the sidewalks below. Streetlights cast pale circles against the white surface. Life without his wealth shadow meant declining private negotiation. It meant refusing quiet settlement in exchange for convenience. The lake house in Minnetonka had once symbolized partnership. Now it represents history, not leverage, not reconciliation. Across town, Dimitri stood alone in the penthouse kitchen, staring at his phone after her reply. The silence on his end was unfamiliar. He had announced divorce publicly. He had structured asset insulation strategically. He had assumed final control would return to private space. Instead, she had moved everything into record. Relief completed its arc. Release settled fully. Identity shift solidified. She was no longer responding to his moves. She was defining her own. The snow continued falling outside both homes, but only one of them stood without shadow. Spring approached slowly in Minnesota. The snow along the Mississippi River began to thin, revealing patches of dark pavement and early signs of thaw beneath bare trees. Zaria stood inside the nonprofit office, reviewing final plans for the official launch of her foundation. Minnesota Women in Financial Clarity. The name had taken weeks to refine. So had the mission. Support women navigating asset division. Educate on executive governance safeguards. Restore confidence through knowledge. Peace did not arrive in celebration. It arrived in alignment. The legal proceedings with Dmitri had not fully concluded, but the court's acknowledgement had shifted everything. She no longer fought for recognition. She built forward. Volunteers arranged printed materials across folding tables. A banner near the entrance displayed the foundation's purpose in clean lettering. Marianne stepped inside briefly before the event began. "You have standing now," she said, "in court and in public." Zaria nodded. Standing did not feel like victory. It felt like ownership. Outside, community members gathered near the riverfront for the afternoon program. Local business leaders, nonprofit partners, and women who had attended early workshops stood beneath temporary white tents. Public humiliation had once defined her name in headlines. Now leadership defined it in invitation lists. She adjusted the microphone on the small outdoor stage. Self-ownership is quiet until it is lived consistently. Today, it would be visible. The winter air still carried a chill, but sunlight reflected brightly off the river behind the stage. Rows of folding chairs filled quickly. Some attendees were professionals. Some were students. Others had followed the court proceedings closely and arrived out of curiosity. Public curiosity had evolved into respect. Zaria stepped to the microphone as quiet settled across the small gathering. "Thank you for being here," she began. Her voice carried easily across the riverfront. "I did not plan to build this foundation, but experience taught me something important. Financial clarity protects dignity." The statement was simple, direct. She spoke about digital safeguards, about documentation review, about asking questions before signing trust amendments, about understanding executive authority within marriage. No mention of Dmitri by name. No public accusation. The transformation felt complete. Where humiliation once stood, purpose now stood. She introduced volunteer advisors who would lead workshops across Minneapolis and St. Paul. She outlined plans for quarterly seminars at local universities. Earned respect does not demand applause. It invites participation. When she finished speaking, the applause came naturally, not for spectacle, for substance. Across the river, beyond the crowd, a familiar black sedan remained parked near the edge of the lot. Inside, Dmitri watched quietly. He did not approach. He listened. From inside the parked sedan, Dmitri watched the gathering continue. He had not announced his presence. No cameras tracked him now. No board members surrounded him. Just distance. On the stage, Zaria moved with calm assurance as she answered questions from attendees. A young entrepreneur asked about protecting personal digital credentials. An older woman asked how to challenge trust amendments within marriage. Zaria responded with precision. "Documentation is not confrontation," she said. "It is protection." Her tone carried steady authority, not defensive, not reactive. Across the small crowd, several heads nodded in agreement. Self-ownership was visible now, not in court filings, in leadership. Dmitri leaned back slightly in his seat. He remembered the birthday dinner, the microphone, the certainty in his voice when he announced divorce publicly. He had expected collapse. Instead, he witnessed expansion. The foundation banner behind her shifted slightly in the breeze. Minnesota Women in Financial Clarity. The words were simple, direct, earned. He turned off the engine but remained seated. Approaching her would alter the balance again. Distance preserved it. On stage, Zaria thanked community partners who had supported early workshops. She outlined upcoming sessions across the state. Peace had replaced performance. Leadership had replaced reaction. The event moved into smaller group discussions beneath the white tents. Volunteers distributed printed guides on asset protection basics. Advisors scheduled follow-up workshops for women who requested one-on-one consultations. Zaria stepped down from the stage and walked through the crowd, greeting attendees personally. A university student approached her first. "I watched the court proceedings," she said. "Seeing you stay composed helped." Zaria smiled softly. "Composure protects clarity," she replied. Another woman, older, held a printed seminar schedule. "I am navigating a separation now," she admitted. "Your interviews gave me courage. Peace is not the absence of conflict. It is the presence of grounded direction." Across the river, Dmitri stepped out of the sedan briefly but remained near the vehicle. He watched her engage without interruption, without defensiveness, without reference to him. The narrative that began with public humiliation had ended in public leadership. He had announced divorce in front of investors. She had launched a foundation in front of community members. One performance sought control. The other built structure. Snow remnants along the riverbank glistened faintly under late afternoon light. Zaria returned to the small stage to close the event. The crowd quieted again. This time, not in shock. In respect. The sun lowered slowly behind the Minneapolis skyline as Zaria stepped back to the microphone one final time. The river reflected streaks of gold and pale blue. The air remained cool, but the crowd stayed. She looked across the faces before her. Rebuilding is not loud, she said. It is deliberate. It begins with knowing your value before someone questions it. Silence settled with attention, not tension. I once believed partnership meant silence during correction, she continued. Now I understand partnership requires equality in record and in voice. A few heads nodded slowly. Behind the gathering, Dmitri stood at a distance near the riverbank. No cameras surrounded him. No executives stood beside him. Just quiet observation. Zaria finished her closing remarks with calm certainty. This foundation exists because clarity protects dignity, she said. And dignity should never depend on who stands beside you. Applause rose naturally, not dramatic, earned. She stepped down from the stage as volunteers began folding chairs. The transformation was complete. Public humiliation had not ended her. It had redirected her. As evening settled fully across the river, she glanced briefly toward the edge of the lot where the black sedan had been parked. It was gone. Have you ever rebuilt after being told you were not enough? Comment your story. Share this with someone rebuilding. Subscribe for the next chapter of American storytelling.